Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Aditya here. Today we are going to dive into a key feature of API Gateway, that is integration types. These integration types determine how API communicates with backend stages or backend services, and mastering them is essential for designing effective and flexible APIs. Okay, so this API gateway or our API gateway offers several integration types. So we have so many integration types and each with a specific purpose. But the main types what we are going to cover here is HTTP or AWS integration. So this is the most common integration used around the world, where we'll use some existing HTTP endpoints or we use some AWS service. It may be Lambda, it may be SQS, it may be SNS or a step function, any other AWS service. And the second one is AWS proxy, that is Lambda proxy integration. So what is this AWS proxy or Lambda proxy, right? We have already seen this. So whenever we are creating a particular method, right, we used to enable that proxy integration. So that is what. So by using that Lambda proxy, we achieve a structured event request, right? But yeah, we will dive deeper here and we'll see what happens when we use Lambda proxy integration and how it is beneficial for us. Okay, and until now, whatever we are doing, that is AWS proxy, Lambda proxy only. And the third one is HTTP proxy integration, and the fourth one is the mock integration. Okay, so we will look at them thoroughly, and each type offers different ways to connect your API to backend services or handle requests. So each type offers different ways to connect your API to backend services or handle requests. And moving on to the first integration type, okay, that is HTTP or AWS. So we have the HTTP or AWS integration. This is where API gateway interacts with HTTP endpoints. For example, you have any existing HTTP endpoints, or you deployed something in your EC2 instance and you want to access those HTTP endpoints, right? So in that case, you could use this integration type, or you can interact with Lambda, or you can interact with other AWS services like SNS, SQS, stuff function, and number of AWS services option is there, so you can use that. Okay, and here you need to know the information, right? The first information is you can configure both integration request and the integration response. So whenever you are using HTTP or AWS integration type, in this integration type, you must configure both integration request and response. So you have to configure by yourself, and you need to set data mapping by using mapping templates to transform requests and responses. So you need to use these mapping templates for data transmission. And this is often used in scenarios where your API needs to interact with services like SQS, SNS, or other AWS services. Okay, and when it comes to proxy integration, right, where we have used earlier, you don't need to do all this setup. You don't need to configure this integration request response, and you don't need to use mapping templates there. But here you are stringent. You have to use all these things strictly. Otherwise, you won't get your request and response properly. And transformations also you have to handle in your API gateway. So whenever you select this particular integration type, you need to remember these things. And for example, you have your client and he got REST API from the API gateway. Okay. And if you use the API gateway with HTTPS or AWS integration type, then the request and response should be parsed using mapping template. So the API gateway has to handle this and send to the other service, right? Here you are not using Lambda. So even you can use Lambda with or without this integration type. So Lambda has two options. One is HTTP or AWS integration type, and second one is the other AWS proxy option. But the other services, right, irrespective of Lambda, other services you can only use this integration type only. There is no proxy integration for the other services. So that's why I'm using step function here. You can add Lambda also, right? So here you have to explicitly manage requests and responses, and the data transformation should be managed by mapping templates. Okay, and moving on to the next integration type, that is AWS proxy or Lambda proxy. So until now, whatever we're using is AWS proxy only. So all the hands-on, right? Whatever we see in AWS proxy only. So in this, right, we will direct request inputs to Lambda. So in this setup, the incoming request from the client is passed directly to a Lambda function. And the Lambda function is responsible for handling logic of the both request and response. And there is no need of templates here, mapping templates here, as all data including headers and query string parameters is passed directly as arguments to the Lambda function. Okay, so whatever we are using currently or whatever we have seen until now in the hands-on session, that is AWS proxy integration. So the advantage here is you can directly route request to Lambda. So no need to do those parsing, right? Using mapping templates, you don't need to do any parsing and all. This particular AWS API Gateway act as an some client, right? So whenever the client sends the responses, whenever the client sends the request, it act as a middleman and send quickly that whatever request they send to the Lambda, and there is no custom logic you can execute there. But in the Lambda section or in the Lambda where you have to handle these logics. Okay. So for example, you have client like this and he's having a REST API with AWS API Gateway. And if you enable AWS proxy integration directly, the request or responses, right, sent to the Lambda. And Lambda is responsible for doing request and response parsing. So API Gateway, what it will do, whatever the request come, just send to the Lambda. Whatever request from the Lambda, just take it and send to the client. That's it. It won't give you the customization perspective. With respect to customization or with respect to change, right? You can't change your request and responses, parsing them in API gateway. So if you enable the proxy integration. Okay, so here is the example. So for example, if you invoke Lambda by using proxy integration, yes, AWS proxy integration, right? You will get a request like this, which will have all the information, and the response should be passed like this or whatever way you want, but you have to send all the information from the Lambda end only. This information can't be passed in the API gateway, and it acts as a middleman and pushes the response to the client and pushes the request to the Lambda, right? But it won't do any custom logic there. So that is the advantage of AWS proxy. But if you want to execute some custom logic in the API gateway end itself before reaching to the backend, in that case, this integration type, HTTP or AWS integration type, is ideal for you. Okay, and moving on to the next integration type, that is HTTP proxy. So whenever you see the proxy, you understand, right? API gateway is not going to do anything. The underlying service has to do all the stuff. So the same thing, right? With HTTP proxy, the HTTP request is passed directed to the backend without any processing by API gateway. So here API gateway won't process anything. It will directly pass that request to the backend. So here the backend is HTTP, and previous integration type is AWS proxy, right? There the backend is Lambda. So only Lambda has this privilege or availability of proxy thing. Okay, and the HTTP response from the backend is then forwarded to the client. So it simply forwards the response to the client, like how the AWS proxy works, right? API gateway won't do anything, won't do any customization to response and request. It's just take the request and send to the client. Here, send to the backend. Here it is HTTPS backend, or there it is AWS Lambda backend. Okay, but the response also same. It will get the response from the backend and send directly to the client without doing any parsing there or executing any customize or executing any custom logic there. Okay, so the only difference between the AWS Lambda integration, Lambda Proxy integration, and HTTP proxy integration is a optional thing, that is you can add headers. So the good thing is you can add headers. Okay. For example, like API keys, that thing you can add. For example, your client hit your API gateway and you can add an API key header and send back to the client. Sorry, backend. So if backend requests the API key, they can use the API key from the header. Apart from that, there is no parsing here. Okay. And if you see the example, you have a client, he is accessing the API gateway through an REST API. And right, the API gateway is using the integration type HTTP proxy. So the underlying service, for example, ALB, which is exposing an HTTP endpoint, right, will get request directly. There is no parsing here. Only thing we can add is one header to include our API keys. Other than that, you can't do any customization here. Get the request from the client, just push it to the backend. Get the response from the backend, just push it to the client. That's it. There is no customization like AWS proxy, Lambda proxy. Okay, so if you want customization, you have only one option, that is HTTP or AWS integration. And finally, right, we are moving to the last integration type, that is mock. So as the name suggests, it will be mock only. Okay, so this is used when you want API gateway to return a response without sending the request to the backend service. So that means you will get a response and there is no backend at all, right? You haven't configured your backend, but you want to test your API. So in that case, you can set up this mock and it will send you some mocked response to you. No need to go to the backend and get the response. So it will be useful, right? It's a great way to test and prototype your API without needing a fully functional backend. So it's a great way to test and prototype your API without needing a fully functional backend. So you don't need any working backend here. You just mock your backend response and test your API code. So in that purposes, mock integration type will be beneficial to you. Okay. I hope you understand all the different integration types, right? AWS or HTTP and HTTP or AWS integration type and Lambda proxy, HTTP proxy and mock. These are four main integration types widely used there, and the differences I hope you clearly understand. And moving on to the next topic, that is mapping templates for AWS and HTTP integration. So in the integration type, AWS and HTTP integration type, right, we have seen we can able to parse the requests and responses. So mapping templates are an advanced feature of API Gateway that can be used for both HTTP and AWS integrations. And they can allow you to do few things. That is, you can rename or modify the query strings, and you can modify the content of the request and response bodies, and you can add and modify the headers also. So these many modifications you can able to do when using the mapping templates, but these are not available in proxy integrations and mock integration. Okay, and the second one is you can use velocity template language, that is called VTL, for complex logic. So we will see this in our hands-on session, what is VTL and how it looks. But this using this using this VTL, right, you can edit the requests and responses of your services. For example, client send one request to you, you can use VTL, pass that request as per your convenience, right? You can add customization here and send to the backend, and backend send some response, right? You take that response and pass it using some custom logic and send it back to the client. Okay, and finally, you can filter the output results to remove unnecessary data. For example, you got some response and you can filter it out, whatever you don't need, and you can rename the keys. So you can do so many things by using these mapping templates. So these templates give you precise control over the data that flows through your API. So you will have more control than the proxies. Proxy don't have any control. They just bypass it, take the request and send it to the backend. But here, before sending to the backend, right, you can execute so much of custom logic. And before sending to the client, right, you can execute some custom logic. So that's the advantage of AWS and HTTP integration, and by using mapping templates, you can achieve all these features. Okay, so let's look at two examples of mapping template. The first one is JSON to XML with SOAP. Okay, suppose you have a REST API that needs to interact with SOAP API. Okay, so your client send JSON. For example, our client send JSON, but our SOAP service need XML, right? It will accept request in XML, but our client sending request in JSON format, right? Then you can use a mapping template and you can extract necessary data and build a SOAP message and transform XML response to JSON. SOAP message and send to the SOAP service, right? Once SOAP service send back to response, then convert that XML response to JSON for the client, right? So that is the advantage of using mapping templates. You converted from JSON to XML on the fly. You didn't write that logic in even client side or server side. You have written that logic in API gateway. And if you see in the flow diagram, it will look like this. So your client, right, he is sending a REST API in the JSON request, and using the API gateway, we enable HTTP or AWS integration, where, right, we using mapping template, what we did, we passed the request to XML. So whatever the JSON request we got, we passed to an XML and send into the SOAP API. And once the SOAP API send that XML request or response to us, then by using the mapping template itself, we passed it to JSON and send back to the client. So this is how this mapping template will be useful. And the another example of the mapping template is accessing the query parameters. For example, right? Imagine a client send a request like this: http://example.com/path. So he sends some query parameters like this: key 1, value 1, key 2, value 2. So in that case, right, with a mapping template, we can do is we can extract these query parameters, even we can rename them, and we can make them something like a custom variables or a map and send it to the backend. So for better clarity, see this picture. So we have a client is sending this, or we use query parameters. Okay, our API gateway exposing this particular URL, and we are sending, the client is sending these query parameters. So by using mapping template, right, we can extract key 1, key 2 like this, and even you can modify the names of these query parameters. You can create a custom map and send it to Lambda function as a custom variables. So fascinating, no? That is the advantage of using the mapping templates. So I hope you understand about the different integration types, and the important integration type is HTTP or AWS integration type, where you have more control over request and response. And the good thing is you have seen the examples also. By using mapping templates, how can you transform those requests, right, and responses. So in the conclusion, understanding these integration types and how to effectively use mapping templates can greatly enhance the flexibility and power of your APIs. Whether you are testing the mock integration, interfacing with AWS services, or simply passing through the request with HTTP proxy, right? API Gateway provides the tools, all the tools that you need. Okay, so thanks for tuning in. And if you find this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more AWS content. See you in the next time. Bye. Hey everyone, welcome back to the hands-on session. So in this session, we are going to see how different integration types works in AWS API Gateway. So for that, I opened the API Gateway in a new tab, and in this tab, we are going to create a new API. Okay, so for that, click on Create API, and in the API type, we are going to choose REST API option and click on Build. So once you click on Build, right, you will open this Create REST API page. In this page, you will have API details, new API, and different options. All these options you are aware. So I'm selecting new API and I'm giving name my integration test. Okay, this is my integration test API, and API endpoint I am leaving as regional and creating the API gateway. So once I created a API gateway, right, I got in the resource section, I got slash, and we'll do one thing. We'll try to add the backend here for the slash itself. So for that, click on create method And once you click on create method, right, in the method details, we need to select the method type. So I am selecting get as my method type. And after that, you have the Lambda function selected, right? Previously, we used to enable the Lambda proxy. So we are using proxy Lambda, right? Even though if you select HTTP, you will have HTTP proxy integration. And right, and this HTTP used when you have any other endpoint in your system. Since my AWS account don't have any other endpoints, I'm going to explain this, but it's simple, right? If you understand the Lambda function without Lambda proxy integration, it is similar to the HTTP without HTTP proxy integration. And if you enable HTTP proxy integration, you don't need to customize your request and responses. That is the difference. And we have mock. So mock, I think we don't need to define anything, right? Mock is nothing but it will return some response to you. So you just only test your API. That's it, right? But if I explain the AWS Lambda itself or Lambda function itself, most majority of the things you will understand. So even though if you select other AWS service, right, instead of Lambda, right, you won't get that proxy integration option, but you need to select those resources in the regions and AWS service, right? So I am taking Lambda as that AWS service itself. So what service we are going to, or what integration type we are going to explore here is HTTP or AWS service. And we are treating Lambda function as a separate AWS service, and we are not enabling any Lambda proxy integration here for the ease of example. So once we are good, right, we need to select the Lambda. So I am selecting the existing Lambda, that is my canary test Lambda. So I selected my Lambda. So we are good, right? If you see here, I'm selected the Lambda and I'm creating the method. So once I click on the create method, my Lambda method, that is slash get, got created. And in this Lambda integration, right, you can able to see I'm using canary test Lambda. And if I go to test and click on test, you can able to see I'm getting hello from Lambda version 2. Okay, fine. So we created one get method under this integration test Lambda, and we have used Lambda integration. Okay. So if you observe here, right, if you observe this response, or right, you can see it came as an JSON object. Even status code also came as an JSON object. But right, if I go back to the other API which we have already tested, that is our test API, and I can go to the test demo get method, and if I click here, right, click on test, and you can able to see my response is coming like this, hello from Lambda version 2. This is not a JSON object. So here you can able to observe, right, the status code will be removed, and also the object, right, the response body, it knows it's a string value. But here whatever the response we are getting from the Lambda directly coming to API gateway, there is no parsing happening here, right? So sending the same thing to the client sometimes work, or sometimes you need to customize it. So the main use case of this HTTP or AWS integration type is to customize your requests and responses. Okay, so for that, what we have to do? So to customize your request and response, what we have to do is we need to use the mapping templates. And how to use the mapping templates, I will show you now. So since we have enabled the HTTP or AWS integration type, right, you have to go to integration request. So this is where you can able to achieve that. You can modify the request that is going to the backend service. Here it is Lambda function. It may be step function, it may be anything. And here in the integration response, you can able to modify backend response also. So if you go to the previous API gateway, right, and if I go back here, you can able to see here we have proxy integration. That means if you enable proxy, the response, you don't have any control to pass the response. So here API gateway won't do anything. Whatever the response came from the Lambda, it will send back to the client. But here you have that customization privilege, so you can able to customize it. So we will do one thing, right? We'll first try to customize the integration request by using VLT, velocity template language. So that is our mapping templates only. So how to do that? Once you selected the integration request, if you scroll down below, right, you can able to see there is one thing called mapping templates. So this is where we are going to use our mapping templates to do the customization for us. So I will do one thing, I will click on edit here. So once I click on edit, right, I can able to change my integration type also here. And if you scroll down below, you can able to add the mapping template. So this is the place where you can add your mapping template. And if I click on add mapping template, this page will be opened. So here always the content type is application/JSON only, and for simplicity's sake I am going to use some general template. So if you observe here, you have one thing called general template, generate template, and this drop down, right, if I click here you will have three options. One is method request pass through, and another one is the empty, and another one is the error. So this is method request pass through. So if I click it, right, there was some template is already available for you. This is the mapping template. And if you observe this particular pattern, right, $input.json, I think you have already seen in the previous session, right, $input.json dollar is the getting the object of the response or request, whatever input it got, it will be accessed by using this particular syntax. This is mapping template, and the language is called velocity template language. Okay, so this is how you can able to achieve or get the different parameters by using the for loops, and even you can add the if conditions, the conditional statements, right? You go through your request and pass through all the parameters, all the query strings, right? You create one JSON object here and send it to the backend. So likewise you can able to achieve this. So if I set this, right, I will save this, and I will go to the underlying backend also to give you the example. So I'm opening the Lambda and see how we will receive the response here in the Lambda. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print the request. For that I'm going to the code, and once I open the Lambda function here, right, anyway we are printing the event. So we are good. What I will do is I will go here, right? I will go here in the integration request we have already saved, right? And since we saved, we have to do a deployment. So until now we haven't did any deployment. Our deployment is also not needed, right? You can directly go to test and click on test here. You can able to see. So now we'll go to the Lambda and go to the monitor section, and we'll see the logs in CloudWatch, because here it is taking some time to open. So once this logs got opened, we'll see how the event got print. Okay, so logs is getting opened. Okay, view CloudWatch logs. We have to see the CloudWatch logs. Yep. So it is loading. So this is the log group, and this is the log stream, latest one. I'm opening the log stream, and here you can able to see, right, how it passed. So it passed the body JSON parameters in this and path query string. It make an JSON object and send it back to the backend. Send it to the backend. Fascinating, right? And you can have control to do that. So we are using the generate template here in the API gateway. But if you want, you can use that velocity language and you can create your own template, create your own request to the backend. Similarly, the response also. So if you click on the integration response, and if you go down, right, you can able to see you have mapping template option. So here again we'll try to use the generate template itself. Click on edit. Okay, once you click on edit, if you scroll down, you will have this mapping template option, where always it uses application/json and generate template, right? I'm going to use method request pass through. So what are the response we got from the Lambda? We will do some passing here. So this is also using the same format, right? This is also using that velocity thing. But the good thing is, right, whatever the response you got, you don't need to use the same response, right? You can do these many modifications. But for simplicity sake, I am going to empty this, right? We will send a simple object instead of complicating things, right? I will use like this. So what I will do is I will saying my response should be like this. So I will send back my response like message. So only one key we are going to send as message, and inside the message, right, we need to mention about what was our message. So for that we use this $input dot JSON. This is velocity template language. Don't get confused with it. You have to learn that. But if you want to customize your requests and responses, this is very quick to learn language only. Generate template itself, I got to know, right? So here you can mention dollar dot body. So since we are returning body, right? I'm saying dollar dot body. So we'll see how this response will be passed now. I'm saving this. So once the save completed, come to the test, right? And click on test again. You can able to see we are sending now message, not body, and it's a JSON object. Look how fascinating it is. We have control. Whatever the response we got, we can able to customize it as per our needs. And if you want to send some other information also, you can add in your response integration response, right? You can go here, edit, and do whatever magic you want. Likewise, you will have this customization privilege in API Gateway if you choose HTTP or AWS integration type. And the other integration types we have already seen. Lambda proxy integration is equivalent to HTTP proxy integration, and this particular example is equivalent to HTTP backend. Since we don't have any HTTP endpoints, we are not using. And finally, the mock is nothing but we don't have any backend, so it will give some random responses. That's it. Okay, so I hope you understand the concept and you understand the hands-on well. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more AWS tips and tricks and content. See you next time. Bye.